Welcome to New Beginnings with Karen Delk, where we celebrate the creativity, courage, and wisdom of people creating change. We highlight those who chart new paths, make new life and career choices, and face turning points. We explore lessons that accompany changes, both welcome and unwelcome. New Beginnings covers topics from the worlds of business, education, health, and the arts. Our guests and the stories we share inspire viewers to make positive changes within their own lives and communities. Now here is our host, Karen Delk.
Welcome to New Beginnings with Karen Delk, and I am thrilled to have joining me once again Anthony Lopez, who is founder and managing director of L&L Associates and the former president of Ansel Healthcare. Anthony, welcome to New Beginnings.
Karen, Happy New Year. It's good to be back with you again. We did this just about a year ago exactly, I think.
Exactly. I do remember you were in sub-zero temperatures outside the studio.
That's
And
right.
we did two shows that were really excellent on diversity and inclusion and your legacy leadership book.
Yes.
So I wanted to have you back because you've been doing some thinking around diversity and inclusion, and you've developed a top 10. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts around that.
Well, when we spoke last on diversity, we kind of did a bit of a historical journey. We kind of reminded ourselves of where the organizations have come, say over the past almost 25, 30 years, right? The early days of corporations creating chief diversity officers and the work done by many companies to essentially improve the process around diversity, which back then didn't even have the inclusion portion. It was
Correct.
just the diversity portion. And as that work has evolved, it's had its ebbs and flows and ups and downs. Um, I think the many of the corporations, some of the better ones, of course, I'm fond of Johnson and Johnson because I was there for 18 years, and I think J&J is one of the pillars of companies that have done well with diversity and inclusion and have really integrated it into their culture as an organization. But I've also seen over the past, 25 years that the progress has been made in a glacial pace in many cases. And in some cases, we've seen actually steps backwards. And so it started to cause me to think, and if you need more evidence of that, you can certainly look at the diversity at executive teams. And we know that 10, 15 years ago, we saw maybe a few more African Americans and Latinos and people of color, men and women, people of color on those executive teams. But if you look now, it seems like it's sort of reverted a little bit
I would
backwards.
agree. I go
Yeah,
into a number of organizations and there's been retrenchment. I would agree with that.
right. And if you look at the most recent data published on boards, we know, right, that women, I'm talking about U.S. based companies, but women and Latinos specifically compose less than 3% of board seats. And those numbers are not changing, even with the latest movements and emphasis on putting more women on boards and promoting more women into the executive ranks. The numbers are just so far behind that they're really not catching up fast enough. And if we continue at the pace that we're going, it's going to take another 20 or 30 or 40 years before we get to the parity. And it's not that it's about parity specifically. It's not just that it's about the fairness of the number. It's about the power of having true diversity at all levels of the organization that really enable a company to be more effective and get better results. Because we all know that the companies that have greater diversity outpace the results of those that don't.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I just want to add something because I earlier this month attended a session with one of the prominent um, recruiting firms about
Mhm.
women on corporate boards.
Yes.
And the trend that they're seeing is that term limits are extending.
Right.
So what's happening is those who are on boards, who are mostly male, mostly white,
Right.
are extending their term.
Right.
And of the open seats, a lot of times the board does their own recruiting, and most people recruit people like themselves. And when
Sure.
they do go outside and engage a search firm, um, then it's for someone who they're looking for someone who is either already on a board, and so it's kind of circulating the same people, which was very insightful, very insightful.
Well, that and I've attended meetings recently as a member of the Latino Corporate Directors Association. We just had our convening in Chicago just a few months ago, and we had some of these, executive firms that focus on board recruiting as a part of the process come and present some of the latest data. It's not just the dynamic that you mentioned about the extension of terms, which is ironic because they're already long enough. But there's also the additional dynamic that there are actually less board seats available. They're actually shrinking the size of some boards. And so that complicates it even further, right? They're staying longer and there's less available seats. The turnover is going to be slower and less available seats. Now, combine that with the idea of, like you said, we tend to focus on people that we're comfortable with. And one more dynamic, most of the searches for boards, and not that this discussion has to focus on just board positions, but most of the searches for boards do not come through executive search firms.
That's correct.
It's less than 20%
That's
actually
correct.
board searches. So that leads to yet another dynamic that says, so it's really your network, it's really who you know, it's really your reputation and other things, and maybe even a bit of luck, being in the right place at the right time that lands you the opportunity to be on board. And the final dynamic, since we're kind of covering all the bases on it, is that getting that first board is the hardest. After that, they keep calling you. And
That's
the reason
correct.
they keep calling you is because you kind of already passed the filter. They know that you're a qualified board executive, and they keep going back to the same well. So that's why you have then people who are sitting on 2 and 3 and 4 or 5 boards, which doesn't quite add to the diversity that we probably need or want. All of that said, that also leads us to say, well, maybe there are other ways to increase diversity. For example, you have a lot of companies that are not the Fortune 1000, which is where this data is coming from. The data we just finished talking about in terms of percentages of seats and reduction in seats is really the Fortune 1000 companies.
That's correct.
Well, there are many other companies that are not Fortune 1000, thousands of companies that are growing and that require and need and will want boards. And so that is probably the fertile ground for perhaps individuals who are looking for that first board seat to make their entry into board service into those positions. And of course, serving on a not-for-profit is also a good way to get that entry-level experience, if you will, relative to boards.
Yeah, and I was just going to add some numerics. What I learned a few weeks ago is that you want to be, if you're targeting that Fortune 1000, you're really talking about a board that's $500 million to $1 billion, right?
Yeah.
And then below that, maybe you get, 500 million
Right.
or below. Now, those are huge numbers, but in today's economy,
Yeah.
not really. And
really.
so that was very insightful for me to learn that. But to your point, nonprofit board service is really the stepping stone to for-profit board service. And to your point, you don't have to go to the 1000s. There are many, many
Sure.
companies, domestically as well as internationally,
Sure.
that are looking for very qualified individuals who can bring a level of experience to a board. But as you said, this isn't all about boards, but it's
Yeah.
where we started in the conversation.
Right. The conversation really that conversation and my participation in many of these forums with the Latino corporate directors and so forth led me to sort of start rethinking my not my position, but at least I wanted to be a bit provocative with what I thought was important for organizations. And really, I'm not talking again about boards. I'm really talking now about corporations and how they should be thinking about diversity and inclusion today. And what are ways that we can provoke them to take greater action faster, to move things up the spectrum a little bit more dramatically than they've moved before. And so I kind of started thinking about when I'm speaking to colleagues, when I'm speaking on stage on leadership topics, and of course, as a leader, having diversity and inclusion front of mind is one of your strategic imperatives. It has to be one of your strategic imperatives. Because again, the data are clear that if you have a diverse organization, they're going to do better. The results will be better. So it's not a sort of a nice thing to do. It's a smart leadership business thing to do. And yet it doesn't seem to get the traction, and it doesn't always stay on the table. It sort of falls back or it gets delegated onto the chief diversity officer or the HR officer, or it sort of lands someplace else and it doesn't stay on the radar always of the leaders of the organization. It becomes something they don't think about as often as they should.
And before you share, your tips, let's talk a little bit about why we think that is delegated.
Yeah. Well, look, elite leaders, having run a large global company with thousands of employees, as I mentioned to you last time we spoke last year, traveling 300,000 plus miles per year, many priorities, dealing with shareholders sometimes, dealing with investors, doing M&A work. I mean, all the complexities of running a corporation, there's a lot. There's a lot there. So as a leader, you clearly must select the things that you focus on more specifically and the things that you delegate to your colleagues and to your teams. I'm not suggesting that leaders like CEOs of companies don't think of diversity. They often do, and they often speak on them. I just don't know that it permeates down to becoming a to-do and a measured to-do with the same equal force and the same equal weight, perhaps, that the other metrics that some of the leaders in the organization have on their KPIs for that year. So that may be one reason. The other reason is that the macroeconomics of the world sometimes just sort of overcome all of that. It's easy to cut things when times are tight, like training, travel, right? These are things that you can cut easily because you got to cut your expenses, times are tight and so forth. And sometimes programs, if you want to call them that, or initiatives such as diversity and inclusion, if they're not really rooted in the culture of the organization, if they're not seen as a business imperative by the leaders of the organization, but just rather something they must do for perception reasons, for whatever other reasons, then it might fall into that category of, it's not as important when times are tight. Let me focus on the real business drivers, if you will.
When it really should be part of the real business drivers because it delivers real business results.
That's the ironic part of this, right? There isn't probably a leader who would, at least publicly, not admit that they understand the data, that the data are very clear, that they intuitively understand that having greater diversity of all levels, of all types, true diversity of thought that comes with true diversity of the organization in terms of people, race, gender, you name it, that they would all say, oh yeah, it drives business results. And then you go, well, then why isn't it one of your top 3 imperatives? It boggles the mind sometimes. But I don't want to judge too harshly because I think back to when I was running Ansel Healthcare and CareFusion before that. And yes, diversity was because I cared deeply about it. It was always there. But I also can confess that it wasn't always front of mind in every business discussion. Yes, we made sure we had diverse slates and that sort of thing. But was I really, really, really driving it as hard as I should have all the time? Probably not. Probably not. Just sort of that you got other pressures and other things that become important.
Hmm.
So I don't want to judge my colleagues and leaders who are out there trying to do a good job and running corporations who are very busy with a lot of things too harshly. I want to just sort of poke them a little bit and say, let's not forget this.
Perfect.
Let's not.
Perfect. So tell us, what are some of the top 10?
So I wanted, the last time I spoke to an audience where the subject was diversity and inclusion, they had asked me for my thoughts on it. I wanted to be a bit provocative when I made a statement, particularly because I had a lot of folks in the audience whose job was D&I in their corporations, whether they were chief diversity officers or managers of diversity, or somehow they were involved, HR people, folks like that, who were involved with the process deeply and who obviously cared deeply about it. And so I wanted to say things like, we ought not recruit diverse talent. And then I would pause and see their, I could
Your
sense
reaction.
their anger. I could sense their anger and their hatred towards saying something. How could you possibly say that you don't want to recruit diverse talent? And then I would say the second half of the statement, which is I want to attract diverse talent. And they would go, okay, well, you're playing with words. I'm like, no, I'm really not playing with words. There's a fairly specific difference between recruiting someone, right, going to the right schools where the diverse talent is, paying as much money as you can to take them away from somebody else who's going to pay more money, and I can recruit the talent. That's actually not that hard. I can go get them. And companies that say they don't know where they're at, they got their head in the sand, right?
Absolutely.
So we can go get them and we can go recruit them into the organization. Terrific. But if we don't have the culture in the organization that receives them, enables them, coaches them, makes them feel welcome, challenges them, all those other things that we have to do with all employees, regardless of race, gender, and color and creed, then they're just going to probably be there for a few years and then they're going to move on. So you're going to recruit them and maybe you're just going to lose them later on. So what I want to do is create an organization that attracts that talent. And if you create a culture that is attractive to diverse talent, sure, you're still going to have to go recruit them. You're still going to have to let them know you're here. But your reputation is going to help as well.
It
Right?
precedes the
Sure.
the recruiting process.
Sure, you're going to be that organization where people say that's where you want to go. And we have metrics for that. We have companies that are listed as the best diversity companies to work for. And again, J&J and companies like that always make it to the top of the list. There's a reason for that, right? Because they're doing things to make themselves attractive. But companies often have a very specific metric or very specific outreach on recruiting diverse talent. And so they go, check, we're doing that. And I'm like, that's you may be spending good money to recruit, but you're not keeping them and retaining them. So
And that's the
so once
real
I
true
say,
measure is the retention.
absolutely, right? So then I go to the next statement and I say something like, well, I don't want to retain diverse talent. Then again, people go, how could you possibly say? You just mentioned you want to attract them and bring them in, and you don't want to focus on retaining them? No, I want to focus on developing them and challenging them. And if I focus on developing them and challenging them and promoting them when appropriate, then they're going to stay, right? Not all of them, but I'm going to increase my retention by being the type of organization. And so I just wanted the leaders that I was speaking to focus on the right element of their strategy. Don't just focus on the recruiting element of your strategy. That's useless unless you have a really good, attractive magnet to bring them in and want to keep them. Don't focus on retaining them by giving them more money, because again, that's only going to keep them for a short period of time until somebody else pays more money.
Mm-hmm.
You have to challenge them, develop them, right? We know, particularly the millennials, right? We know they want to come in, they want to feel useful and valued and, nurtured, groomed. That's what you focus on, right? So that was my second one. My third was don't drive diversity and awareness. Again, there was like eyes open, like, what do you mean don't drive diversity and awareness? No, don't drive awareness around diversity. I think most people these days, particularly with social media and all kinds of other things, we are aware of diversity as an issue. We understand some of the dynamics that go with it. What we need to be driving is inclusion, right? This idea of truly leveraging all the diversity that we have in our organization and utilizing that diversity and really including them in the process of developing strategy of the business itself, right? It's not just good enough to drive the awareness that I have black and white and gay and lesbian and straight. Great, that's good education. But how do I include those individuals? How do I learn to get the best out of those individuals, understanding how they think, how they operate, how they feel included, and then move the organization forward? So, we can keep going. If you like, I can go down all 10.
Yeah, if you can. Yeah, we have some time.
Okay, so the fourth one is don't promote diversity. What do you mean don't promote diversity? No, I don't want to get promoted because I'm a Puerto Rican or a Latino. Nobody wants to get promoted because of that version of them. I want a level playing field, right? I want an equal opportunity, true equal opportunity to demonstrate performance, results, and metrics. And then I want to be competing equally for those opportunities, right? So again, it's not that we ought not make sure that it is happening. It's not that we ought not, look at the metrics and make sure that African Americans and women and Latinos and Asians and so forth are getting promoted at the same rate, because you have to still make sure it's happening.
Absolutely.
But don't promote based on some quota system.
Mm.
Don't promote based on it must be this because we don't have one of those. Create the level playing field where you really have been clear on what your performance indicators are, what the expectations, what are the values of the organization, and how does that person live to those values of the organization, right? In J&J, and again, I keep using J&J because I love that company, the standards of leadership of J&J, the expectations of leaders in J&J were very clear. Ethical behaviors and those sorts of things. And if you didn't meet those, you were not going to get promoted in Johnson & Johnson. It didn't matter what you were, right? So that was my fourth one. My fifth one was don't just celebrate diversity. We do a great job every year with, Hispanic Awareness Month and, African American Heritage Month and
Women's Month.
Women's Month and gay, lesbian. I mean, I am all for those, and nobody likes a party more than me. Okay? But it's not about the party, right? It's not about just the celebration. It's not just about the great tasty food and the music and the diversity of the culture. It's beautiful to experience that, and that's a great thing to do. But you really have to respect diversity, not just celebrate it. You really need to respect it. If you just celebrate it, but you don't respect it, you don't acknowledge it, you don't leverage it, you don't really want to say, man, now that I know that about Karen and her race as a Black woman, how do I get the most out of that and squeeze it in a good way to really get the organization propelled forward, right? That's what I think. So that was number 5. Number 6, and I'm reading a little bit off my cheat list here. Mm-hmm. You don't measure diversity numbers, right? You don't just measure how many African Americans do we have, how many Hispanics do we have, how many women do we have. You do measure that, but you don't just measure that. You measure the numbers and the results that they drive. Right? Most companies have history of what the results were 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and they know what their diversity was then. So wouldn't it be easy, fairly easy, to measure, are we doing better financially as an organization? And maybe not just financially, but are we getting better recruiting? Are we getting better retention? Are we getting better in all the metrics that matter to shareholders, particularly in a public company? And is our stock price showing that? Right? Are results better in a private company? Are our results better than they were last year? Because we have a diverse organization, because of the efforts that we're putting around our culture. So measure that. Don't just measure the numbers of diversity. The next one for me is diversity and inclusion is not an HR-driven activity. It's a leadership imperative. And as soon as it only feels to an organization that it's delegated or relegated or placed, that doesn't mean that VPs of HR ought not be champions of diversity. Of course they are. But every leader in the organization ought to be a champion of diversity, not just the VP of HR. And so every time there's a presentation on diversity, if it's the VP of HR that's getting up and putting up the slide deck, I'm not sure that's sending the right message, right?
Yeah,
If
and
it,
I just will chime in here. I spoke at a function at Prudential, in November of last year, and there, that very same point that you're making was made, that diversity is something that every individual has a responsibility for.
right,
Um, just as you talk about the spirit and letter, they didn't say this, but this is what it came to mind to me. We talk about the spirit and the letter of the law in terms of how to, be ethical. I'm sure J and J had that with the credo.
sure,
You know,
sure,
every individual has to abide by the credo at J and J.
of course, yeah,
And at Prudential, the point that was made is that it shouldn't be delegated to HR, that every leader has that responsibility and they'll be measured as such.
absolutely, and it needs to be one of their KPIs, right? One of their key performance indicators for every leader, and it shouldn't just be listed because it's a good check. It's been listed. That's the. It's not that it's not already there. Most organizations, particularly the larger ones, the respected ones,
Big
the
multinationals.
yeah, they have diversity on the radar. The question is, are we truly living it
Yes,
every day? Are we really making it a part? And the numbers would say no,
right.
right? The numbers would say no. We're not being as effective with it.
Well, there's
We're
been
it,
retrenchment
right,
to the point we made earlier.
right,
And we shouldn't be going back, particularly when our economy is global and we have better access and
yeah,
better technology and better connectivity
right,
as an organization, even
yeah,
smaller ones, quite frankly, they can
yeah,
get bigger now because of that connectivity, taking on
absolutely,
the ideas
absolutely.
of people in different countries and time zones and all of that.
And that kind of leads to my number eight, right? My number eight is it's not about having a diverse workforce. That's actually not that difficult. Particularly if you think about the kind of individuals that are coming into the workforce now, right? The younger generation that's coming into the workforce now, they're fairly diverse. They're coming in
Absolutely.
fairly diverse, right? Because of the nature of how our country has evolved and its diversity.
So tell us,
And-
because we only have a few minutes, seconds
okay,
left. So what is your
so,
number eight?
so the number eight is about having a diversity at all levels of the organization. It's not good if you have 4,000 employees and you have a lot of diversity, but they're not represented at the very senior or throughout the leadership. The number nine is don't survey your workforce around diversity. Survey them on how they feel on their engagement. How
Mm,
do they feel? Are they really engaged? Are they really connecting and feeling connected to the company? And the last one is probably the most. I think it gets a little smiles from my colleagues, and that is diversity is not exclusive of white.
mm,
Because every time we talk about diversity, the white man feels excluded.
yes,
They've not been a part of that process, and they must be because white is a color.
absolutely.
Okay, so diversity is not exclusive of white; it's inclusive, truly, of all.
Yeah.
Anyway,
And
those are my top 10.
that's perfect. Thank you. I'm glad we were able to squeeze those in because we are out of time.
That was fast.
I know it was very fast. And it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. And I thank you for sharing your thoughts. You're truly a thought leader in diversity and inclusion. And I thank our listeners for tuning in to New Beginnings with Karen Delk.